In 1856, on the collapsing Whitford Plantation, 3 white women made a decision they believed no one would ever question. They seized complete personal authority over the handsomest enslaved man on the estate, a man named Asher, using the plantation's rules to control his movements, his labor, and even the documents that dictated his survival. They thought their plan would tighten their grip on the property and silence anyone who suspected the truth about the estate's failing finances. But by autumn, every ledger was missing. The overseer lay broken in the stables, and the Whitford women were being dragged from their own home in disgrace. Their downfall began the moment they chose Asher as their tool. What did they do to provoke the collapse that wiped out an entire plantation? But let me start from the beginning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The last light of day bled across the South Carolina sky like a wound refusing to heal. Asher straightened from the final bale of cotton, feeling the familiar ache settle deep in his shoulders. The barn stood behind him, its weathered boards gray with age and neglect. Beyond it stretched the fields, row after endless row of picked-over stalks that would need tending again come morning. The Whitford Plantation sprawled across nearly 300 acres, though much of it had gone fallow in recent years. What remained under cultivation demanded constant labor from the 40-some souls who worked this land without choice. The main house rose on a distant hill, its white columns catching the dying sun. Between the house and the fields lay a carefully maintained distance: gardens, walkways, the overseer's cottage, and the stables. The slave quarters huddled near the eastern tree line, a collection of rough cabins arranged in 2 facing rows with a shared yard between them. Asher had lived in the 3rd cabin for 8 years now, ever since being sold here at 17. He knew every rotted floorboard, every gap in the walls where winter wind sliced through. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the horizon, the air pressed down thick and wet, promising storm. Asher wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His shirt clung to his frame, dark with moisture and dust. At 25, he stood tall and strong, his body shaped by years of labor that would have broken weaker men. His face held a calm dignity that unsettled some of the white folks, a quiet intelligence in his dark eyes that no amount of brutality had managed to extinguish. The work bell had rung an hour past. Most of the others had already returned to the quarters to wash and eat what little supper could be scraped together. Asher preferred finishing his tasks properly. It gave him a measure of control in a life designed to deny him any. He was lifting the last bale when he heard footsteps. A boy of maybe 10 approached, one of the house servants, moving with the careful speed of someone carrying a message he feared. "Mistress Eleanor says you're to come to the main house," the boy said, not meeting Asher's eyes. "Says she needs urgent assistance." Asher's hands stilled on the bale. He kept his face empty of reaction, though something cold settled in his gut. Urgent assistance. The words themselves meant nothing and everything. "Now?" he asked quietly. "Right now. She's waiting." The boy turned and hurried back toward the house without another word. Asher watched him go, then looked down at his hands. Dirt creased every line of his palms. He brushed them against his pants, knowing it would do little good. Whatever Eleanor Whitford wanted, it wasn't labor that left visible dirt. He walked toward the main house as thunder rolled closer. The path took him past the kitchen building, where smoke still rose from the day's cooking, past the well where he'd drawn water countless times, past the garden with its careful rows of vegetables meant only for the White family's table. Each step carried him further from the relative safety of distance and deeper into a world where he existed only as property to be used however its owners wished. The back entrance stood open. Asher climbed the 3 steps to the door, knocked once, and waited. Silence answered. He knocked again, then pushed the door open when no response came. "Mrs. Whitford?" His voice carried through the narrow hallway. "In the parlor," Her tone allowed no hesitation. Asher moved through the house with practiced quietness. His boots, worn nearly through at the soles, made soft sounds against the polished wood floors. The parlor door stood ajar. Yellow lamplight spilled into the hallway. He paused at the threshold, then stepped inside. Eleanor Whitford sat in a high-backed chair near the empty fireplace. She was a woman in her early 40s, still handsome in a severe way, with dark hair pulled back tight, and a dress of deep blue that whispered of better financial times. Her posture radiated authority, spine straight, chin lifted, hands folded in her lap with deliberate composure. She did not rise when he entered. She barely acknowledged his presence at all for several long seconds, letting him stand there in his work-stained clothes, while she examined him with the same critical eye she might give a horse she was considering purchasing. "Close the door," she said finally. Asher obeyed. The latch clicked with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Outside, thunder growled closer. The storm would break soon. "The shelf there needs moving." Eleanor gestured vaguely toward a heavy wooden bookcase against the far wall. "I want it positioned by the window instead." Asher looked at the shelf. It was substantial, loaded with leather-bound volumes no one in this house actually read. Moving it would take some effort, but nothing he couldn't manage. Yet something in the request felt wrong. The task could have waited until morning. Could have been assigned to any of the men who worked closer to the house. Could have been, should have been, handled differently. He moved to the shelf anyway. Refusal wasn't an option. Refusal meant the overseer's whip, or worse. Refusal meant making an example of, meant public punishment designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. He'd seen it happen to others who forgot their place. Eleanor watched him work with unsettling focus. She rose from her chair and crossed the room, her skirts rustling. She stood close, too close, as he gripped the shelf and began to shift it. Her hand touched his shoulder, fingers pressing against the damp fabric of his shirt. "You're very strong," she said. Her voice had changed, taken on a quality that made his skin crawl. "I've noticed that about you, Asher. You carry yourself differently than the others." He kept his eyes on the shelf, kept moving it slowly across the floor, said nothing. Her fingers trailed down his arm. "Look at me when I speak to you." Asher stopped moving the shelf, turned slowly, met her gaze because she'd commanded it, and he had no power to refuse. Her eyes held something hungry and cruel, a twisted combination of desire and the absolute certainty that she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice carefully neutral. "Better." She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "You understand your position here, don't you? You understand what happens to boys who forget their place?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Her hand moved to his chest, palm flat against him. "Then you'll understand that when I require your assistance, you provide it without question. Whatever form that assistance takes." The words hung in the air between them, their meaning crystal clear beneath the veiled language. Asher's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression blank. This was the game. This was survival. She held all the power, all the authority, all the protection of law and custom, and the violent machinery designed to keep him exactly where he stood, powerless, exploitable, unable to resist, without inviting his own destruction. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to rattle the window panes. Eleanor's smile widened slightly. Her hand remained against his chest, proprietary and possessive. What followed occurred in the thick silence before the storm broke. Eleanor made her expectations clear through gesture and command, through the deliberate abuse of the vast gulf of power between them. Asher complied, because compliance was the only option that didn't end in blood. She wielded her social authority like a weapon, knowing he couldn't refuse, knowing she faced no consequences for this exploitation, knowing the system protected her completely, while leaving him utterly vulnerable. When she finally dismissed him, Voice calm, posture composed as though nothing untoward had occurred. Asher left through the back door into air that felt too thick to breathe. The first drops of rain touched his face as he walked back toward the quarters. He moved slowly, deliberately, forcing his breathing to stay even, forcing his hands to stay unclenched at his sides. The quarters were dim when he reached them. Most folks had already settled in for the night. Asher went to the wash basin near his cabin and cleaned himself with cold water, scrubbing hard enough to hurt. When he finally entered the small space he shared with two other men, they were already asleep or pretending to be. He lay down on his cot, staring at the ceiling. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. His mind wanted to retreat somewhere safe, but there was nowhere safe to go. Through the thin walls, he heard voices, old Marcus and Sarah, two of the eldest on the plantation, talking low in the next cabin. Their words drifted through the gaps in the boards. "Saw the boy fetch him to the house," Marcus said. "Knew what it meant, soon as I saw." "Not the first time Eleanor's done it," Sarah replied, her voice heavy with resignation. "Won't be the last. That woman thinks she's entitled to whatever catches her eye. Margaret's no better. Heard she's been watching him too. Lord help that boy. Bad enough dealing with one of them." "Both sisters-in-law got their sights on him?" Sarah's voice trailed off into weary silence. Asher closed his eyes. Rain began to drum against the roof, steady and relentless. Across the yard, lanterns flickered out one by one as people surrendered to exhausted sleep. He tried to match his breathing to the rhythm of the rain, tried to find some stillness inside himself where Eleanor's hands hadn't reached. The wind rose, howling through the trees. The storm arrived in full force, shaking the cabin walls. Lightning flashed white and stark through the gaps in the shutters. In that brief illumination, Asher saw movement outside. He turned his head slightly, looking through the narrow space between shutter boards. A figure stood on the main house's back porch, barely visible through the rain. A woman in pale clothing, watching the quarters with an intensity that carried even across the distance. Margaret Whitford, the widowed sister-in-law, standing in the storm, staring toward his cabin. Asher's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't look away, even as another flash of lightning revealed her more clearly. She remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the quarters like a predator marking prey. The rain soaked her dress, plastered her hair to her skull, but she didn't retreat inside. She just watched, and watched, and watched. The storm had passed before dawn, leaving the world soaked and heavy. Asher woke in darkness to the sound of water dripping through gaps in the cabin roof. The dirt floor had turned to mud in places. Around him, other men stirred on their pallets, coughing and groaning as they prepared for another day. He rose stiffly. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with fieldwork. The night had brought little rest, only fragments of uneasy sleep broken by the memory of Eleanor's voice, her commands delivered in tones that allowed no refusal. He pushed the thoughts down deep where they couldn't show on his face. Outside, the sky hung gray and low. Puddles filled every depression in the yard between the cabins. Asher made his way to the well, where Jonas was already working the crank to bring up the first bucket. Jonas was older, maybe 45, with silver threading through his hair and deep lines around his eyes. He'd been on the Whitford plantation since childhood. He knew its rhythms better than anyone. "Morning," Jonas said quietly, not looking up from his work. "Morning." They worked in silence, drawing water and filling the wooden buckets that each cabin would use for washing and drinking. Other men emerged from the quarters, moving slowly in the pre-dawn gloom. The work bell would ring soon. There was never enough time. Asher carried 2 buckets to the third cabin, set them inside, then returned for more. The repetitive task gave his hands something to do, while his mind stayed carefully blank. He'd learned long ago that thinking too much about circumstances he couldn't change only made the weight heavier. By the time full daylight broke, the fields were already filling with workers. The mud made every step difficult. Asher spent the morning helping clear drainage ditches that had overflowed during the storm, knee-deep in cold water and clay-thick sludge. The overseer, Mr. Briggs, rode his horse along the field edges, watching with sharp eyes for anyone who slowed their pace. Asher kept his head down and his movements steady. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning cool. Steam rose from the wet earth. Asher's clothes, damp since dawn, stuck to his skin. His boots squelched with every step. Around him, others worked in similar silence, the kind of quiet that came from exhaustion too deep for conversation. At midday, the bell rang for a brief rest. Asher straightened from the ditch, feeling his back protest. He climbed onto drier ground and accepted a dipper of water from one of the women who'd brought a bucket from the well. The water tasted of iron and earth, but it was cool. He was drinking when he noticed the carriage approaching the main house, black and well-maintained, pulled by 2 horses. It stopped before the front entrance, and a woman in a pale dress emerged with the help of a servant, Helen Pembroke. The preacher's wife made her weekly visit every Tuesday, staying for tea and religious conversation with Eleanor and whatever other ladies happened to be present. Asher had seen her many times before. She was younger than Eleanor, maybe 35, with a small frame and features that might have been pretty if not for the perpetual pinch of worry around her mouth. She carried a Bible and wore piety like armor. He looked away, returning the dipper. But as he turned back toward the ditch, he felt it. That particular quality of attention that raised the hair on his neck. He glanced up. Helen Pembroke had paused on the steps of the main house. She was looking directly at him, her gaze held too long, lingering in a way that made his stomach tighten. Then she turned and disappeared inside. Asher descended back into the ditch and resumed working. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The afternoon dragged. The sun beat down mercilessly now, turning the mud thick and clinging. Asher's arms burned from lifting shovel after shovel of wet earth. Sweat ran into his eyes. Around him, the other workers moved in the same exhausted rhythm, each person locked in their own private endurance. When the work bell finally rang for evening, Asher cleaned his tools at the pump near the barn. His hands shook slightly from fatigue. He was rinsing mud from the shovel blade when he heard footsteps behind him. "Asher!" He turned. Margaret Whitford stood a few feet away, her dress somehow immaculate despite the muddy conditions everywhere. She was younger than Eleanor, perhaps 38, with softer features and brown hair that escaped its pins in delicate curls. Her smile appeared gentle, almost sympathetic. "Mrs. Whitford," he said carefully, setting down the shovel. "Such a dreadful day for working outside," she said, her voice carrying false concern. "You must be exhausted, you poor thing." Asher kept his expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped closer, too close. He could smell lavender water and something underneath it, something desperate that made his instincts scream warnings. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, "for your assistance the other evening. You were so accommodating." The word dripped with meaning that made his skin crawl. "My sister-in-law speaks highly of your reliability." "I just do as I'm told, ma'am." "Of course you do." Her smile widened, showing teeth. "That's what makes you so valuable. You understand your place. You understand that refusing a direct request from the family would be—" She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Unwise." Asher's hands clenched at his sides. He forced them to relax. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She reached out and brushed something from his shoulder. A piece of dried mud that could have been left alone. The touch lasted a moment too long. "We appreciate loyalty in this household, just as we respond harshly to disobedience. I'm sure you've seen what happens to those who forget their position." He had. Every enslaved person on the plantation had witnessed punishments designed to terrify and control. The whipping post near the overseer's cottage bore stains that no amount of rain could wash away. "I remember, ma'am." "I thought you might." Margaret stepped back, her expression shifting to something that resembled kindness in the fading light. "You're a handsome young man, Asher. Smart, too. Those qualities could make your life easier here, or much harder. The choice is yours." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and do sleep well tonight. Tomorrow may require your energy." She walked away toward the main house, her skirts swishing through the mud without seeming to touch it. Asher stood frozen by the pump, watching until she disappeared inside. His heart hammered against his ribs. His breathing came shallow and fast. He forced himself to finish cleaning the tools, forced his hands to move through familiar motions while his mind reeled. When he finally made his way back to the quarters, full darkness had fallen. Lanterns glowed in cabin windows. The smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. Someone had managed to make a thin soup from scraps. Jonas sat on the step of their shared cabin, smoking a pipe carved from corncob. He looked up as Asher approached, then gestured for him to sit. Asher sank down beside him, suddenly aware of how completely exhausted he felt. Not just from the day's labor, from the weight of carrying himself carefully through a world designed to break him. "Saw Margaret talking to you," Jonas said quietly. Asher said nothing for a long moment. Around them, the quarters hummed with low conversation and the sounds of people settling for the night. Children played in the mud, their laughter a bright note in the gathering dark. "She made her expectations clear," Asher finally said. Jonas took a long pull from his pipe, then let the smoke drift into the night. "And Helen Pembroke was here earlier. Saw her watching you from the house. I noticed. Eleanor summoned you last night." It wasn't a question. Jonas knew. Everyone probably knew by now, though no one would speak of it openly. Some horrors were too dangerous to name. "She did." Jonas was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of hard-earned survival. "I've seen this before, Asher. Not often, but I've seen it. White women on plantations where the white men are absent or weak or dead, they get ideas about power, about what they're entitled to, and," Asher's voice came out rougher than he intended, "and there's no good answer. You refuse, they'll have you whipped, maybe sold, maybe worse. Mr. Briggs would do it without question. He don't care about the why, only about maintaining order." Jonas paused. "You comply, it eats at you from inside, changes you. So, what do I do?" "You survive, same as always. You keep your head down. You do what you must to stay alive. You wait for any chance to be different." Jonas turned to look at him directly. The lamplight from inside the cabin caught his eyes. "I ain't saying it's right. I ain't saying it don't make me sick to my stomach to tell you this. But right and wrong don't mean nothing when you're property. Survival means everything." Asher closed his eyes. He wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the impossible choice. But Jonas was right. He'd always been right about the brutal mathematics of staying alive in this place. "There's one more thing," Jonas added. "Eleanor's niece arrived this afternoon while you were in the fields. Young woman named Clara, from Charleston." "Another Whitford?" "By blood, yes. But I seen her when she visited 2 years back. She's different. Treats people like they're people. Not kind, exactly. Just normal. Like how folks ought to be." Asher opened his eyes and stared out at the dark shapes of the other cabins. "One decent person doesn't change anything." "No," Jonas agreed. "But it's worth noting who might be an ally if things go bad. And they will go bad, Asher. This situation, these women using you this way, it can't hold. Someone will find out. Someone will get jealous. Something will break." They sat in silence after that. The night deepened around them. One by one, the lanterns in the other cabins went dark, as people sought what rest they could before dawn came again. Asher finally stood. "I should sleep." "You should," Jonas said, "though I doubt you will." He was right about that, too. Asher had just stepped off the cabin's threshold when he saw her. Clara Whitford stood on the main house's side porch, visible in the spill of light from an upstairs window. She was looking toward the quarters, not with the predatory attention of the other women, but with what seemed like simple curiosity. When she noticed him noticing her, she didn't look away or pretend she hadn't been watching. She just offered a small nod, then turned and went inside. The gesture meant nothing, probably meant nothing. But Asher filed it away in the part of his mind that tracked every detail, every possible advantage in a world that offered him none. He was walking toward the tool shed to store the last of the day's equipment when a figure emerged from the shadows near the smokehouse. Margaret, again. She moved with deliberate calm, her pale dress ghostly in the darkness. She didn't speak this time, just looked at him with an expression that managed to be both gentle and chilling. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the slight smile on her face. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said softly, "after the midday bell, the main house." Her hand reached out and rested briefly on his forearm, a touch that made his flesh crawl. "Don't make me send someone to fetch you. That would be unpleasant for everyone." She brushed past him, her skirts whispering against his legs, and walked toward the main house with unhurried steps. The sound of her footfalls faded into the night. Asher stood motionless beside the tool shed, his muscles locked, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. The tools hung heavy in his hands. Around him, the plantation settled into its nightly quiet, the false peace of a place built on violence and control. He realized with sick certainty that this was no longer isolated incidents. This was systematic, organized. The white women of the Whitford household had created a schedule for his exploitation, passing him between them like property they were entitled to use, because that's exactly what he was to them, property. The next afternoon arrived thick with heat, the kind that pressed down on everything, making the air feel solid. Asher worked near the stables, checking harness leather for cracks and rot. Sweat ran down his back, soaking through his rough cotton shirt. His hands moved through familiar motions, testing each strap for weakness, his mind elsewhere. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret smile in the darkness, heard her soft voice making threats sound like invitations. The morning had brought more of the same careful survival, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor at breakfast service, keeping his expression neutral when Helen Pembroke arrived for her morning visit, and watched him carry water to the house. Now the sun blazed overhead, climbing toward its peak. The midday bell would ring soon. After that, Margaret expected him at the main house. His stomach churned at the thought. Movement caught his attention. Clara Whitford emerged from the house's side entrance, wearing a dark blue riding dress. She walked with purpose toward the stables, her posture straight, but somehow tense. Behind her, a house servant called out something Asher couldn't hear. Clara ignored it. He kept working as she approached, focusing on a particularly worn section of rein. She passed within a few feet of him on her way to the stable door. "Miss Clara," he said, keeping his voice respectful and level. She paused, turning to look at him. Up close, he could see the frustration in her eyes. "Good afternoon." "Begging your pardon, miss, but the ground's still soft from the storm. The northern ridge washed out pretty bad. Might be dangerous for riding today." Her expression shifted slightly. Not anger, but something like determination. "I appreciate the warning. I'll be careful." She disappeared into the stable. Asher returned to his work, though he listened to the sounds of her preparing her horse. The animal was a gray mare, high-spirited and prone to skittishness, not the best choice for uncertain terrain. A few minutes later, Clara rode out. She sat the horse well, her back straight, hands confident on the reins, but Asher could see the tightness in her shoulders. She was running from something, maybe not physically, but emotionally. He recognized the need to escape because he felt it constantly. He watched her ride north toward the tree line, toward the ridge he'd warned her about. For a moment, he considered minding his own business. It wasn't his place to question where a white woman chose to ride. Getting involved could bring trouble. But something in the set of her jaw reminded him of someone trying to break free from invisible chains. Different from his own, but chains nonetheless. He set down the harness and started walking. Then, as Clara's horse picked up speed, he began to run. The ridge came into view as he crested the small hill beyond the stable yard. Clara had dismounted and was leading her horse along the narrow path that ran beside the embankment. The recent rains had carved deep channels in the earth. The edge looked crumbly and unstable. Asher called out, "Miss Clara!" She turned, surprised to see him. The horse shifted nervously, unused to the uncertain footing. Clara reached out to steady the animal, stepping closer to the edge. The ground gave way. Everything happened fast and slow at the same time. The earth beneath Clara's feet crumbled. She stumbled backward, arms windmilling. The horse reared, panicked. Asher was already sprinting, his legs pumping, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached her as she started to fall. His hands caught her arm, her shoulder, pulling her away from the collapsing edge. The momentum carried them both backward. They landed hard on solid ground, Clara on top of him, as the section of ridge where she'd been standing broke away completely and tumbled down the steep embankment. The horse bolted, racing back toward the stable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Asher felt the sharp pain in his shoulder where he'd landed on a rock. Clara's breathing came fast and shallow against his chest. He could feel her trembling. She pushed herself up, her face pale. You saved me." Asher sat up carefully, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "Are you hurt, miss?" "No. No, I'm—" She looked at the collapsed edge, then back at him. "You could have been killed if we'd both gone over." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. She took it without hesitation, then seemed to realize what she'd done, accepting help from an enslaved man, as if they were equals. Her cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't apologize or pull away quickly. Just let him help her to her feet. "Thank you," she said. "I should have listened to your warning." "The ground's tricky after heavy rain," Asher said. He kept his voice neutral, careful. "Glad you're safe, miss." "Asher!" The shout came from behind them. Asher turned to see Mr. Ketchum, the overseer, striding toward them. The man's face was red with anger, his hand already reaching for the whip at his belt. Clara stepped forward instinctively, placing herself between Asher and the approaching overseer. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ketchum demanded, his attention fixed on Asher. "You're supposed to be working the stable harnesses. Who gave you permission to leave your station?" "Mr. Ketchum," Clara began. "And you," Ketchum continued, barely glancing at her, "riding alone without a proper escort. Your aunt will hear about this." He turned back to Asher. "As for you, leaving your work without permission is grounds for discipline. You know that." Asher said nothing. There was nothing to say. Ketchum was right by the plantation's rules. Leaving his assigned work was disobedience, regardless of the reason. "I called for him," Clara said clearly. Ketchum paused. "What?" "I called for assistance. I saw the ground was unstable and asked Asher to help me with my horse. He was following my direct request." Clara's voice was calm but firm. "He saved my life when the ridge collapsed. If he hadn't been here, I would have fallen." The overseer's expression shifted to uncertainty. He couldn't punish Asher for obeying a white woman's request, especially not Eleanor Whitford's niece. The hierarchy was clear. White authority superseded work assignments. "Miss Clara, if you needed help, you should have sent for someone properly." "There wasn't time," Clara interrupted. The situation was urgent. Asher acted appropriately. She met Ketchum's eyes without flinching. "I'll speak to my aunt myself about the incident. You may return to your other duties." It was a dismissal, a young woman with no official authority dismissing the plantation's overseer. Ketchum's jaw tightened. His hand moved to his whip, then away. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "As you say, Miss Clara." He looked at Asher with barely concealed anger. "Get back to work, and don't leave your station again without proper permission." "Yes, sir," Asher said quietly. Ketchum stalked away, his boots heavy on the ground. Asher watched him go, knowing this wasn't over. The overseer would remember this humiliation. Clara waited until Ketchum disappeared over the hill before turning to Asher. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make trouble for you." "You didn't, miss. You helped." The words felt strange in his mouth. When was the last time a white person had helped him without expecting something in return? Still, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You risked punishment to warn me, then risked worse to save me. That deserves more than my thanks." She paused. "You're injured. Your shoulder. It's nothing serious. Let me—" She reached toward him, then stopped, seeming to realize the impropriety. "At least have someone look at it." "I will, miss." Clara studied him for a long moment. "You carry something heavy. I can see it. I don't know what it is, but I can see the weight of it." Asher kept his expression carefully neutral. "Life is heavy for everyone sometimes, miss." "Not equally," she said quietly. Then, as if embarrassed by her own directness, she looked away. "I should get back before my aunt sends a search party. Will you walk with me? I'd rather not be alone after—" She gestured at the collapsed ridge. "Of course, miss." They walked in silence back toward the main house. The escaped horse had been caught by one of the stable boys and stood tied near the entrance, still skittish. Clara stopped a short distance from the house. "Asher," she said, her voice low, "if there's ever anything I can do to help you, please find a way to let me know." He looked at her, surprised. "That's kind of you, miss." "It's not kindness. It's just—" She struggled for words. "It's just what should be normal." She walked away before he could respond. Her shoulders squared as she headed toward the house. Asher stood watching until she disappeared inside. Then he turned back toward the stables, his shoulder throbbing. That evening, Eleanor summoned him to the main house for a supposed repair task that didn't exist. Margaret was there too, waiting in the hallway. Their faces were cold, their voices sharp. "We heard about your heroics today," Eleanor said. The word heroics dripped with contempt. "I was just helping Miss Clara, ma'am." "Yes, and she was quite vocal in her defense of you." Margaret stepped closer. "We wouldn't want her getting the wrong ideas about her place here, about your place." "No, ma'am. Clara is young and naive," Eleanor continued. "She doesn't understand how things work on a plantation. We wouldn't want her misplaced sympathy to cause problems. For anyone." The threat was clear. If Asher somehow gained Clara's favor or protection, they would find ways to hurt him that Clara couldn't prevent. "I understand, ma'am." "Good. Now get out." He left quickly, his mind racing. As he passed through the dim hallway toward the servants' exit, he heard voices from the drawing room. The door had been left slightly ajar. He slowed his pace, moving quietly. "Cannot allow her to undermine our authority." Eleanor's voice, sharp with anger. "She's only been here 3 days." That was Margaret. "Give her time to adjust. She'll fall in line." Will she? Or will she continue treating the slaves like they're human beings worthy of consideration? A third voice, Helen Pembroke. "That kind of softness spreads like disease." "Then we must ensure she learns quickly," Eleanor said. "And we must maintain absolute control over Asher. No room for sentiment. No room for gratitude or sympathy or whatever foolish emotion he might inspire in an impressionable girl." "She defended him publicly," Margaret said. "That cannot happen again." "It won't. I'll speak to her tonight. Make it clear that such behavior is inappropriate and dangerous." Eleanor paused. "As for Asher himself, we need to remind him exactly where his loyalties must lie. Asher moved away from the door, his heart pounding. He slipped out the servants' entrance and into the night. The situation had shifted. Clara's intervention had saved him from immediate punishment, but it had also made him a focal point of conflict between her and the other women. They feared losing control, feared Clara's basic human decency disrupting their carefully constructed system of exploitation, which meant they would push harder, assert their power more forcefully, and Asher would be caught in the middle, crushed between competing forces he couldn't control. He walked slowly back toward the quarters, his shoulder aching, his mind working through the implications. Jonas sat on the cabin step again, pipe in hand. "Heard you played hero today," Jonas said. "Didn't have much choice. And Miss Clara stood up for you with Ketchum." "She did." Jonas nodded slowly. "That's good and bad, Asher. Good because maybe she's an ally. Bad because now the others see her as a threat to their control over you. I know. Things are going to get worse before they get better." Asher sat down beside his friend, staring out at the darkened quarters. "They can't get much worse." "They can always get worse," Jonas said quietly. "Always." Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as servants moved with practiced efficiency. Asher carried firewood to the cooking hearth, keeping his movements steady despite the persistent ache in his shoulder. The kitchen house stood separate from the main residence, connected by a covered walkway where steam and cooking smells drifted on the humid air. Inside the main house, Clara descended the stairs to find Eleanor and Margaret already seated in the breakfast room. The table was set with fine china that showed chips along the edges, small signs of decline that no one acknowledged aloud. "Good morning, Aunt Eleanor. Margaret." Clara took her seat. "Clara." Eleanor's greeting was crisp. "I trust you slept well after yesterday's excitement." "I did, thank you." Margaret poured tea with exaggerated delicacy. "We were just discussing the importance of maintaining proper boundaries on the plantation, especially in these uncertain times." "Uncertain times?" Clara accepted the teacup. "Margaret is being dramatic," Eleanor said, "though she does raise a valid point about behavior expectations. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being practical." Margaret set down the teapot with more force than necessary. "If certain people weren't so harsh in their management approach, we wouldn't have situations where slaves feel emboldened to leave their workstation." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting yesterday's incident was my fault?" "I'm suggesting that when authority becomes tyrannical, it creates resentment. And resentment creates unpredictable behavior." "Unpredictable?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Or perhaps certain individuals have been loosening boundaries through inappropriate familiarity, creating confusion about proper hierarchies." Clara watched this exchange with growing discomfort. The women weren't discussing plantation management. They were accusing each other of something unspoken, something that hung in the air like smoke. "I maintain perfectly appropriate boundaries," Margaret said coldly. "Do you?" "Because I've noticed—" The sound of horses interrupted Eleanor's response. Through the window, they saw a carriage arriving. Helen Pembroke, the preacher's wife, arriving unexpectedly early. Margaret's face tightened. "What is she doing here?" "I didn't invite her," Eleanor said. Helen swept into the house moments later, her dress immaculate, her smile bright and false. "Good morning, ladies. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Eleanor said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We weren't expecting you until this afternoon. I finished my morning devotions early and thought I'd pay a visit." Helen's gaze moved around the room, assessing. "Such a lovely morning after the storms, though I hear there was quite an incident yesterday involving young Clara here." "A minor accident," Clara said. "Nothing serious." "Minor?" Helen settled into a chair uninvited. "I heard the overseer was ready to punish one of the slaves for disobedience, and you intervened quite forcefully." "I simply explained the situation." "How charitable of you." Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. though one must be careful about excessive charity toward those who might misinterpret kindness as weakness. Margaret made a small noise of agreement. Eleanor said nothing, but her fingers tightened on her teacup. "I don't believe basic fairness constitutes excessive charity," Clara said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Helen's smile became fixed and brittle. Margaret shifted in her seat. Eleanor stared at Clara with an expression somewhere between anger and concern. "You're very young, dear," Helen said finally. "You'll learn that fairness is a luxury we cannot always afford in situations where maintaining order is paramount." Clara wanted to argue, but something in the three women's united front made her pause. She had stumbled into territory she didn't fully understand, touching on conflicts that ran deeper than yesterday's rescue. The conversation moved to safer topics: church attendance, weather predictions, gossip about neighboring plantations. But the tension remained, thick and uncomfortable beneath the surface pleasantries. Later that morning, Asher was summoned to help Clara organize books in the library. The room was smaller than its pretentious name suggested, with shelves half empty and furniture showing wear. Clara worked methodically, sorting volumes by subject, while Asher moved the heavier stacks as she directed. "I'm sorry about breakfast," Clara said after a long silence. The way they spoke, about maintaining boundaries and order. "It's not your responsibility to apologize for them, miss." "Perhaps not, but I can still disagree with their attitudes." She pulled several books from a high shelf, revealing a gap in the wood paneling behind them. "This plantation wasn't always like this. My grandfather built something prosperous here. But now—" She reached into the gap and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, her expression troubled. Dust covered its surface. She opened it carefully, scanning the columns of numbers and dates. "I shouldn't be showing you this," she said quietly. "But you saved my life yesterday, and somehow that makes you feel like the only honest person in this house." Asher moved closer, glimpsing the neat rows of figures. Even with his limited reading, he could interpret the pattern: expenses far exceeding income, loan notations with overdue markers, calculations that trended steadily downward. "The estate is failing," Clara said. "Has been for years, apparently. My aunt hides it well, but the numbers don't lie. We're months away from foreclosure, maybe weeks." She closed the ledger. "I feel like I'm living in a beautiful house that's rotting from the inside." Asher absorbed this information carefully. Financial collapse changed everything. Desperate people made desperate choices. These women weren't just cruel. They were frightened, clinging to what little power remained as their world crumbled. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, because some response seemed necessary. "So am I." She returned the ledger to its hiding place and replaced the books. "I inherited a small sum from my mother. Not much, but enough to live independently if I'm careful. I've been considering leaving, but my aunt depends on the income I bring to the household." She paused. "Though I wonder if staying here makes me complicit in things I don't fully understand." Before Asher could respond, raised voices echoed from somewhere in the house. Clara looked toward the door, then back at him. "You should probably go. I can finish here." "Yes, miss." He left the library and moved through the hallway, intending to return to his assigned work. But as he passed the drawing room, he heard Helen's voice sharp with accusation. "Seen the way you look at him, Margaret? It's inappropriate and dangerous. How dare you?" Margaret's response was venomous. "You're one to talk about inappropriate behavior. I maintain proper Christian restraint." "Christian restraint? Is that what you call those evening visits to the quarters?" A sharp intake of breath. Then Helen's voice, lower but no less intense. "You know nothing about my pastoral duties." "Pastoral duties? Of course." Margaret laughed bitterly. "We all have our justifications, don't we? You with your prayers, Eleanor with her authority, me with my loneliness. But at least I don't pretend my actions serve God. You're being deliberately cruel. I'm being honest. Something none of us have been in months. Footsteps approached the door. Asher moved quickly, stepping into a side corridor before either woman emerged. But he'd heard enough. The alliance between these women was fracturing, each one suspecting the others of hypocrisy, each one fearing exposure more than anything else. Their power came from unity, from presenting a united front of white authority that couldn't be challenged or questioned. But unity required trust, and trust was crumbling beneath the weight of shared guilt and mutual suspicion. Evening arrived with the usual humid weight. Asher carried water buckets to the main house porch, setting them near the kitchen entrance. Through an open window above, he heard Eleanor's voice, quiet but intense. Must maintain absolute control. No room for error or hesitation. And if Clara continues to interfere? Margaret sounded tired. Then we ensure she understands the consequences. Not for her, obviously, but for those she tries to protect. Meaning Asher. Meaning anyone who benefits from her misplaced sympathy. We make it clear that her kindness only brings suffering. Eleanor paused. As for Asher himself, he must remain compliant and invisible. No more incidents, no more opportunities for anyone to notice him. He's rather difficult not to notice. Then we make noticing him dangerous. For everyone involved. Asher set down the last bucket carefully and walked away, his mind working through what he'd learned. The ledger showing financial ruin, the women turning against each other, their growing fear that control was slipping away. He'd spent weeks enduring their exploitation, surviving through silence and careful submission. But the situation had changed. They were vulnerable now in ways they'd never been before. And vulnerability, Asher realized, could become leverage if he was careful enough, patient enough, and willing to become something he'd never imagined being. The fog came thick that morning, rolling across the fields like something alive. Asher stood near the broken fence line, hammer in hand, watching Jonas test the rotted rails with careful pressure. Each piece they touched crumbled a little more, revealing how long these repairs had been delayed. "Whole place is falling apart," Jonas said quietly. "Not just the wood." Asher drove a nail through the replacement rail, the sound sharp in the muffled air. "You hear something?" "Heard plenty. People talking in the quarters last night. Saying things feel different?" "Wrong." Jonas lowered his voice further. "Women arguing in the big house. Overseer getting nervous. Something's shifting." "Shifting how?" "Don't know exactly, but folks who've been here longer than me say it reminds them of before, when the previous master died, and nobody knew what would happen next. Everything uncertain. Dangerous uncertain." Asher tested the rail's stability. It held. "What do people think will happen?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, selecting another piece of wood. "Some think the plantation might get sold. Others think the family will bring in someone harder, meaner, to squeeze out whatever's left. A few—" he paused. "A few think maybe something better could come. But those folks are dreaming. Maybe dreams aren't always foolish. They are when they get you killed." Jonas looked at him directly. "I see how you've been lately. Quiet, but thinking. Watching everything. That kind of thinking gets noticed, Asher. And being noticed here, I'm already noticed. Can't help that." "No, but you can help what you do about it." Jonas drove his own nail home. "Just be careful. Whatever you're planning." "I'm not planning anything." "Good. Keep it that way." They worked in silence for a while, the fog slowly burning off as the sun climbed higher. Other workers moved through the distant fields, their shapes ghostly in the remaining mist. The morning felt suspended somehow, as if the whole plantation was holding its breath. Around midday, a house servant approached. "Asher, Mrs. Pembroke needs you at the chapel." Jonas gave him a warning look, but said nothing. Asher set down his tools and followed the servant toward the small building where Helen held her weekly prayer meetings. She stood inside, surrounded by stacks of hymnals that needed moving. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tight. "These need to be carried to the main house for this evening's gathering." "Yes, ma'am." He began lifting the stacks. Helen watched him with an expression that shifted between guilt and anxiety. After several trips in silence, she spoke suddenly. "Asher, I want you to understand something." He paused, holding a stack of books. "Ma'am, I am a godly woman. I take my Christian duties seriously. Whatever misunderstandings might exist, they come from a place of spiritual concern." Her hands twisted together. If anyone were to suggest otherwise, they would be bearing false witness. Asher said nothing, which seemed to agitate her more. "These are difficult times," Helen continued. "The community talks. People make assumptions. A woman in my position must be above reproach. And I am. I absolutely am. But sometimes perception matters more than truth, and perception can be controlled by those who wish to cause harm. I understand, ma'am." "Do you?" "Because I worry that certain people might speak carelessly about things they don't understand, creating trouble where none exists." She moved closer, her voice dropping. "It would be very unfortunate if such misunderstandings became public, for everyone involved." The threat underneath her anxious words was clear. Asher met her gaze steadily. "I don't speak carelessly, ma'am." No, I suppose you don't." She seemed uncertain whether his silence reassured or frightened her. "Just remember that discretion protects us all." "Yes, ma'am." He finished moving the hymnals and left quickly. But before he reached the fields again, Margaret intercepted him near the smokehouse. "A word, Asher." He stopped. Margaret looked around to ensure they were alone, then spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Mrs. Pembroke spoke with you." "Yes, ma'am. About moving hymnals. Don't play simple with me." "What did she say?" Asher chose his words carefully. "She mentioned concerns about misunderstandings." Margaret's expression hardened. "I'm sure she did." "Helen is terrified her reputation might suffer if certain behaviors came to light. She's trying to ensure your silence." "I'm always silent, ma'am." "Are you?" "Because silence can mean many things. Compliance, loyalty, or simply waiting for the right moment to speak." She studied him. "Helen is dangerous when cornered. She'll throw anyone else under scrutiny to protect herself. You'd be wise to avoid her entirely." "That's difficult when she summons me, ma'am." "Then tell her I've given you other tasks. Better yet, tell Eleanor. She has no love for Helen's self-righteous hypocrisy." Margaret started to leave, then turned back. "And Asher, whatever Helen promised or threatened, remember that she has far less power than she pretends. Her husband controls her life completely. She's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." The afternoon brought more labor in the fields, but Asher's mind stayed focused on the morning's conversations, each woman revealing her fears, each one trying to manipulate him through different tactics. Helen's anxious threats, Margaret's bitter warnings. As evening approached, he was carrying tools back to the shed when Eleanor appeared in his path. "You've been much in demand today," she said coldly. "Yes, ma'am. Just following instructions." "Are you? Or are you encouraging attention through some subtle defiance I can't quite identify?" Her eyes narrowed. "Everything was orderly before you started inviting chaos." "I don't invite anything, ma'am. Your very existence invites complications. Your appearance, your manner, the way people respond to you." She stepped closer. "Clara has taken an unfortunate interest in your welfare. Helen can barely focus during her visits. Margaret watches you constantly. And through it all, you maintain this infuriating composure, as if you're somehow above the situation." Asher kept his voice level. "I'm trying to survive, ma'am. Nothing more. Survival requires invisibility. You seem incapable of achieving it." She studied him with cold assessment. "I wonder sometimes what you think about. Whether you imagine there's some way out of your circumstances. whether you entertain foolish hopes. I try not to think too much, ma'am. Liar. You think constantly. I see it in your eyes. That intelligence you try to hide. Her tone became harsh. Remember that intelligence without power is simply another form of suffering. You cannot think your way to freedom, Asher. You can only survive through absolute obedience. She walked away before he could respond. Asher stood there, processing the interaction. Eleanor feared his intelligence. Margaret feared Helen's desperation. Helen feared exposure. Each woman trapped in her own anxiety, each one seeing him as both tool and threat. He understood now what Jonas had warned against. His very awareness was dangerous, but it was also the only weapon he had. That evening, Clara found him near the well during his brief break between tasks. Asher, wait. He stopped. Clara approached with obvious concern. I wanted to apologize again for how they treat you. All of them. I see how they summon you constantly, speak to you with such cruelty disguised as authority. It's not your responsibility, miss. Perhaps not. But I live in that house. I benefit from its structure even as I despise what it represents. She hesitated. Do you feel safe here? The question was so unexpected that Asher didn't immediately answer. Clara's eyes showed genuine worry. I mean, truly safe, she continued. Not just physically, though, that too, but… She struggled for words. I sense something wrong in how they treat you, something beyond the normal awfulness of this place. And I want you to know that if you ever needed help, if there was ever anything I could… Miss Clara! Eleanor's voice cut across the yard. Inside. Now. Clara flinched, but didn't immediately move. I'm serious, Asher. If you need help. Thank you, miss. She left reluctantly. Asher watched her go, feeling something shift in his calculations. Clara's empathy was real. Her offer, genuine. In a house full of manipulation and fear, she represented something different. Actual kindness, however constrained by circumstance. He finished his tasks and started toward the quarters. But as he passed near the main house, he heard raised voices through an open window. The dining room. He moved closer to the wall, staying in shadow. Your fault entirely! Margaret's voice, shrill with anger. Your constant demands create exactly the attention we're trying to avoid. My demands? Helen sounded equally furious. You're the one who can barely control yourself whenever he's nearby. Both of you will lower your voices, Eleanor commanded. This accomplishes nothing. Nothing? We're falling apart, Eleanor. The pretense is crumbling, and you're too proud to admit it. The pretense is necessary. For what? Maintaining an illusion while everything collapses around us? Margaret laughed bitterly. The estate is bankrupt. Our reputations hang by threads. And we're fighting over control of a situation none of us can actually control. If you'd shown more restraint from the beginning… Restraint? You summoned him first. You set this entire pattern in motion. I maintain proper authority. You've turned it into something shameful. We've all turned it into something shameful. Helen's voice cracked. And God will judge us for it. God is already judging us. A sharp knock on the front door silenced them instantly. Asher heard footsteps, then a servant's voice. Mr. Avery, to see Mrs. Whitford. The banker, arriving unannounced. Through the window, Asher glimpsed Eleanor's face go pale. Margaret stood frozen. Helen gripped the edge of the table. Show him in, Eleanor said finally. And bring tea. Asher moved away quickly, slipping back toward the quarters. The fog had returned with nightfall, thicker than before. Somewhere in the darkness, Jonas was probably waiting to ask what he'd learned. Everything, Asher thought. He'd learned everything he needed to know. Morning arrived cold and sharp. Frost outlined every blade of grass, every fence post. Asher woke before dawn with the others, his breath visible in the cramped quarters. Jonas sat up on his cot nearby, moving slowly. Big day, Jonas muttered. Overseer's been up since before sunrise, checking everything. Asher nodded. Word had spread quickly the night before. The banker was returning at first light to inspect the property thoroughly. Every enslaved worker understood what that meant. When white men in suits came to examine land and ledgers, someone's world was about to collapse. By the time the sun rose properly, Mr. Ketchum had everyone positioned. Fields that had been left partially harvested were suddenly full of workers. Tools that had been broken for weeks were hastily repaired and displayed. The barn was swept. Fences were straightened. "Make it look profitable," Ketchum barked. "Make it look like this place runs itself." Asher worked alongside others, stacking wood near the smokehouse where it could be easily seen. His hands moved automatically while his mind stayed alert. He watched the main house, waiting. Mr. Avery arrived in a black carriage just after breakfast. He stepped down carrying a leather case and wearing an expression of severe neutrality. Eleanor met him on the front porch, dressed formally despite the early hour. Her smile looked frozen. "Mr. Avery, what an unexpected pleasure." "Mrs. Whitford." His tone made it clear this was business, not pleasure. "I trust you received my letter regarding the outstanding accounts. There must be some confusion." "There is no confusion. The loans are 3 months past due. The interest alone exceeds your quarterly income." He gestured toward the fields. "I'm here to assess whether the collateral justifies extending further credit." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "Surely we can discuss this inside." "I prefer to see the operation first." Avery began walking. Eleanor followed, her dress rustling stiffly. Margaret appeared in the doorway but stayed back, watching. Ketchum hurried forward to guide the banker, pointing out improvements and yields with desperate enthusiasm. Asher continued working but shifted positions to stay within earshot as Avery toured past. The banker asked sharp questions. How many acres under cultivation? What were the actual harvest numbers from last season? How many workers? What maintenance costs? Ketchum stumbled over answers. Eleanor provided figures that Avery clearly didn't believe. The banker made notes in a small journal, his expression growing colder with each field they inspected. When they reached the area where Asher worked, Avery paused. "These men look underfed." "They're perfectly adequate for the work required," Eleanor said quickly. "Adequate workers produce adequate yields, which explains your declining output." Avery studied the fence line. "This entire section needs replacement. The soil looks depleted. Your irrigation system is outdated by 20 years. We've managed thus far. You've managed to accumulate debts you cannot repay." Avery closed his journal. "I've seen enough. We'll discuss terms inside." They walked back toward the house. Eleanor's face had gone rigid. Margaret met them at the door, her expression anxious. The three of them disappeared inside with Avery. Ketchum remained outside, pacing near the porch. His anger was obvious. When workers nearby slowed their pace slightly, he shouted threats until they moved faster. His eyes kept drifting toward Asher, lingering with suspicion. Midday came. The sun climbed higher, but provided little warmth. Asher and others were given brief breaks to eat cornbread and drink water from buckets. Jonas sat beside him on the ground near the barn. "Banker didn't look pleased," Jonas said quietly. "No. Place is falling apart. Everyone knows it. Question is what happens when it finally goes under." Jonas tore his cornbread into smaller pieces. Sometimes when plantations fail, they sell everyone off separate, break up families to cover debts. Asher had considered this. "Maybe. You thinking about something specific?" "Just watching. Listening." Jonas studied him. "You've been doing a lot of that lately. Watching and listening. Ketchum's noticed too. I'm just trying to survive." Surviving don't usually require memorizing conversations and counting ledger numbers. Jonas kept his voice low. "I'm not saying stop. I'm saying be careful. Overseer's already suspicious about you getting too much attention from the house. He sees you acting too smart, too aware. That's when things get dangerous. Before Asher could respond, the front door opened. Avery emerged, followed by Eleanor. Her face looked strained. Margaret stood in the doorway behind them, wringing her hands. 3 months, Avery said clearly. If the outstanding balance isn't settled within 3 months, the bank will foreclose and auction the property to recover losses. Surely, some arrangement. I've made the only arrangement possible. 3 months. Good day, Mrs. Whitford. Avery climbed into his carriage and departed. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch. Then she turned sharply and walked back inside. Through the open door, Asher heard her voice rise immediately. This is your mismanagement, your wasteful spending and poor decisions. Margaret's response was equally sharp. My spending? You're the one who insisted on maintaining appearances we couldn't afford. Both of you stop, Helen's voice joined. Fighting solves nothing. We need to pray for guidance. Prayer won't pay creditors, Margaret shouted. The door slammed shut, muffling their argument. Ketchum barked orders to resume work. Asher returned to his tasks, but he could feel the shift in atmosphere. Panic spreading through the main house like fire through dry grass. Afternoon dragged on. The sun began its descent. Asher was carrying tools back to storage when Eleanor appeared suddenly in his path. Her eyes looked wild. You! This is somehow your fault. Asher stopped. Ma'am? Everything falling apart. The timing is too perfect. You've brought some curse on this house. I'm just working, ma'am. You're doing something. I see it in how you watch everything, how you listen. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think you're clever. You think you can outlast us. But when this place collapses, you'll go down with it. You'll be sold off to the worst plantation we can find. Somewhere you'll break within a year. She walked away before he could respond, her shoulders shaking with suppressed fury. Asher continued to the shed and stored the tools carefully. His heart beat steadily. He'd expected this, the lashing out, the desperate need to blame someone powerless. It meant the pressure was working exactly as he'd observed. As evening approached, he finished his assigned tasks and started toward the quarters. But Clara appeared near the well, gesturing for him to wait. Asher, she looked around nervously. I need to tell you something. Miss Clara, if they see us talking. I know. I'll be quick. She lowered her voice. I have a small inheritance from my father. Money my aunt can't touch. I've been planning to leave within a few weeks, before this place completely falls apart. Asher said nothing, waiting. I want to help you escape, Clara continued. When I go, there might be a way to get you out too. Hidden in the carriage, or with forged papers, or, I don't know exactly, but I could try. Miss Clara. Asher kept his voice gentle but firm. You know what would happen if they caught you helping me run? I don't care. You should. They'd call it theft. You'd lose everything. Your inheritance, your freedom. Maybe worse. But you'd have a chance. At what cost to you? Asher met her eyes. I won't let you destroy yourself trying to save me. Clara's expression showed both frustration and sadness. Then what? You just accept this? I accept reality. But that doesn't mean I'm not looking for opportunities. She studied him carefully. You have a plan, don't you? Something you're not telling me. I have hope, miss. That's all. Hope based on what? Asher glanced toward the main house. Based on watching very carefully. Based on understanding that desperate people make mistakes. Based on being patient when others can't afford patience. Clara seemed to understand something in his tone. You're using their chaos against them. I'm surviving? No. She shook her head slowly. You're doing more than surviving. You're calculating. And somehow, that's both terrifying and necessary. She hesitated. If you need anything, information, access to documents, anything I can provide without getting us both killed, tell me. Why? Because you saved my life. Because you're the only person in this house who hasn't lied to me. Because watching them torture you makes me sick. She stepped back toward the house. Just promise you'll be careful. Always, miss. She left quickly. Asher continued to the quarters, his mind working through new possibilities. Clara's offer wasn't just kindness, it was access. She could move through the house freely, see documents, overhear private conversations. He spent the evening memorizing everything he'd learned. The banker's assessment, the 3-month deadline, the women's fracturing alliance, Clara's resources and willingness to help. The pieces were arranging themselves, but the pattern wasn't complete yet. Full darkness came. Most of the quarters settled into uneasy sleep. Asher stepped outside briefly, needing air. The main house stood dark except for a single lamp burning in an upper window. He wondered which of the women was awake, worrying about debts and exposure and collapse. Footsteps approached from behind. Jonas emerged from shadow. "Ketchum's been watching you," Jonas said without preamble. "All day. More than usual." "I know. He told some of the other workers you're getting too influential. Said you've been acting above your station." Jonas moved closer, his voice urgent. "That's how it starts, Asher. Overseer decides you're a threat to order. Next thing you know, he's making an example. What am I supposed to do? Stop thinking? Stop observing? I'm saying hide it better. Act simpler. More broken." Jonas gripped his shoulder. "I know you're planning something. I don't know what. But I see it in how you move through this place now. Like you're gathering pieces for something bigger. Just make sure Ketchum doesn't see it too." Asher looked toward the overseer's cabin. A light burned there as well. He imagined Ketchum sitting awake, watching the quarters, planning punishments. Danger from above, danger from beside, danger from every direction, but also opportunity. The plantation falling apart, the women turning on each other, Clara offering help. 3 months until foreclosure. "I'll be careful," Asher said finally. Jonas nodded and headed back inside. Asher remained a moment longer, staring at the darkened main house. Behind those walls, 3 desperate women were probably still arguing. In 3 months, this entire structure might collapse entirely. He just had to survive long enough to see it happen. And then decide what to build from the ruins. The following afternoon arrived hot and still. No breeze moved through the fields. The air pressed down like something solid, making every breath feel thick and difficult. Asher worked near the cotton press, operating the mechanical lever with steady rhythm. Around him, other workers moved with unusual quietness. Conversations happened in whispers. Glances shot toward the overseer's cabin more frequently than normal. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Jonas appeared beside him during the water break. "Ketchum's been talking all morning." "About what?" "About making examples. About maintaining order when everything else is falling apart." Jonas kept his voice barely audible. "Says discipline has gotten too loose. Says certain people have forgotten their place." Asher continued drinking from the ladle. "He say any names?" "Didn't have to. Everyone knows who he means." The afternoon dragged forward. Heat intensified. Asher's shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He kept working, kept moving, kept his expression carefully neutral. Around 3 o'clock, a commotion erupted from the main house. Eleanor's voice carried across the yard, sharp and furious. "Where is she? Where did she go?" Servants scattered in different directions, clearly searching for someone. Margaret emerged onto the porch, looking flustered. "She was in her room this morning." "Well, she's not there now." Asher understood immediately. Clara had left, probably trying to finalize her travel plans, arrange passage north, gather the resources she needed to escape. But Eleanor had discovered her absence. The search continued for nearly an hour. Finally, one of the kitchen workers found Clara returning from the road, carrying a small bundle. Her face showed both defiance and fear. Eleanor met her niece at the front steps. Her voice dropped too low to hear individual words, but the tone carried pure rage. She gripped Clara's arm and pulled her forcefully inside. The door slammed. Through the window, Asher saw Eleanor physically push Clara toward the stairs. Margaret followed, adding her own sharp words. Clara disappeared up to the second floor. The door to her room slammed hard enough to rattle the glass. Asher kept working, but his mind calculated rapidly. If Clara was confined, she couldn't help, couldn't access documents, couldn't provide information or assistance. His one ally had just been neutralized. Evening approached. Workers began moving toward their evening tasks. Asher was assigned to bring firewood to the kitchen. He loaded his arms with split logs and headed toward the main house. Inside, he could hear Eleanor's voice still raised, coming from somewhere upstairs. Margaret responded with equal sharpness. The household felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Asher delivered the firewood and turned to leave. But as he passed through the hallway, he noticed the back stairs, the narrow servants' passage that led to the second floor. Clara's room was at the end of that hallway. He hesitated only a moment. Then he climbed quickly, moving with the practiced silence of someone used to being invisible. The upstairs hallway stood empty. Clara's door showed light underneath. Asher approached carefully, listening for footsteps. He heard nothing except muffled argument still happening in Eleanor's chambers. He pulled a small piece of folded paper from his pocket, something he'd prepared earlier, just in case. On it, he'd written in careful letters, "Stay strong. This will pass. Trust patience." He slid it under Clara's door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside. The paper disappeared as she retrieved it from her side. A whispered voice came through the door. "Asher?" "Yes, miss." "They're furious. They think I was planning to run. They've locked me in until they decide what to do with me." "I know. Just stay calm. Don't give them more reason to—" Footsteps sounded on the main staircase. Asher moved immediately, heading back toward the servants' stairs. But, as he reached the landing, Ketchum appeared at the bottom, blocking his path. The overseer's expression showed cold satisfaction. "What are you doing up here?" "Delivering firewood, sir." "Firewood goes to the kitchen." "Kitchen's downstairs." "Yes, sir. I got turned around." "You got turned around." Ketchum climbed the stairs slowly. Near Miss Clara's room, right after she got locked in for running off. He reached the top step, standing close enough that Asher could smell tobacco on his breath. "That seemed like coincidence to you?" "Sir, I wasn't—" "Shut your mouth." Ketchum grabbed Asher's shirt. "I've been watching you, watching how you move through this place like you own it, how you get special treatment from the women, how you think you're somehow different." He shoved Asher against the wall. "Found something interesting today." Ketchum pulled a ribbon from his pocket. Pale blue silk, clearly expensive. "This was near the barn this morning. Know who it belongs to?" Asher recognized it immediately. Clara's ribbon. She must have dropped it during her attempt to leave. Now, why would Miss Clara's ribbon be near the barn? Ketchum's voice dropped dangerously low. Unless someone was meeting her there. Unless someone was helping her plan something improper. "I never—" Ketchum's fist connected with Asher's stomach, driving the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping. "I said shut your mouth." The overseer grabbed his collar and dragged him toward the servants' stairs. "You've been getting away with too much for too long, acting like you're special, like you're protected." He forced Asher down the stairs roughly. Asher's shoulder hit the wall hard enough to send pain shooting down his arm. They emerged into the yard. Several workers stopped to watch, their faces showing fear and helplessness. "Tomorrow morning," Ketchum announced loudly, "everyone's gonna see what happens when someone forgets their place. When someone thinks they can disrespect the order of this plantation." He dragged Asher toward the tool shed, a small windowless building used for storing equipment. Inside, the space smelled of metal and old wood. Ketchum shoved Asher against the back wall and pulled rope from a hook. "Hands!" Asher didn't resist, as Ketchum bound his wrists together in front of him. The rope bit into his skin, tied tight enough to restrict circulation. "You're gonna spend tonight thinking about consequences," Ketchum said. "And tomorrow morning, everyone's gonna watch you learn about respect." He walked to the door, then paused. "You thought you were clever. Thought you could manipulate things, play games with people above your station." His smile showed no warmth. "But you're just property. And tomorrow I'm going to remind everyone what happens to property that gets too bold." The door slammed shut. Darkness consumed everything. Asher heard the sound of a bar sliding into place, locking him inside. Footsteps moved away across the yard. He stood motionless, letting his eyes adjust to the near-total blackness. A tiny crack between boards let in the faintest thread of light from the rising moon. His wrists already ached from the rope. His stomach still hurt where Ketchum had hit him. But worse than physical pain was the realization of how completely the situation had collapsed. Clara confined. Himself imprisoned. Public punishment scheduled for dawn. The path to freedom that had seemed almost within reach now felt impossibly distant. He moved carefully to the wall and slid down until he sat on the dirt floor. The small crack showed a fragment of the main house. As he watched, a lamp lit in Clara's window. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he saw movement. A pale hand pressed against the glass. Clara's hand. She couldn't see him here in the darkness of the shed, but somehow she knew to look. Somehow she understood he needed to see that gesture. A promise, a connection, a refusal to give up. The hand remained there for several heartbeats before withdrawing. The lamp stayed burning. Asher leaned his head back against the rough wood. Outside, he heard Ketchum's voice giving orders to other workers, heard the normal sounds of the plantation settling into evening routines. Tomorrow would bring pain, humiliation, possibly worse. But tomorrow would also bring opportunity, because desperate men made mistakes, because public spectacles drew attention, because chaos created gaps in control. He just had to survive until those gaps appeared. Footsteps approached the shed. Through the crack, Asher saw Ketchum's boots stop just outside. "Sleep well," the overseer called. "Dawn comes early, and I want you well rested for your lesson." The boots walked away. Asher sat alone in darkness, his bound hands resting in his lap, and braced himself for whatever morning would bring. Dawn arrived gray and heavy, pressing down on the plantation like a wet blanket. Inside the tool shed, Asher had not slept. His shoulders ached from sitting with his back against the wall all night. The rope around his wrists had grown tighter as his hands swelled slightly, but his mind remained sharp, alert, calculating. Through the narrow crack between boards, he watched the sky shift from black to charcoal to pale ash. Workers began moving across the yard, their voices subdued. Everyone knew what was planned for this morning. Everyone knew they would be forced to witness it. Footsteps approached the shed. Multiple sets. Asher straightened his back, preparing himself, but the door did not open. Instead, voices carried from nearby. Tense, urgent conversation happening just outside. "Mr. Ketchum, sir." That was James, one of the older house servants. "Mr. Avery's arrived again, brought 3 men with him this time. Mrs. Whitford wants everyone at the main house immediately." Ketchum's voice came sharp with irritation. "I'm in the middle of something." "Sir," she said immediately. "Said it's about the bank situation. Said it can't wait." A long pause. Then Ketchum's boots moved away from the shed, heading toward the main house. The other footsteps followed. Asher waited, listening carefully. The yard grew quieter. Most workers had been summoned to the house as well, probably to present the plantation at its best for the banker's inspection. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Then new footsteps. Lighter, more hesitant. They stopped at the shed door. The bar scraped as someone lifted it. The door opened slowly. A woman's silhouette appeared against the morning light. Clara's servant, the one who helped in her chamber. the woman who had always moved through the house with careful discretion. She stepped inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "Miss Clara sent me." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "She said you had papers, ledger pages. She said you need to give them to the banker's assistant before Mrs. Whitford can hide everything." Asher's mind worked rapidly. Clara must have slipped the servant a note, perhaps during the early morning when Eleanor was distracted by Avery's arrival. "Can you untie my hands?" he asked quietly. The servant moved forward, working at the knots with shaking fingers. "Hurry! Ketchum might come back any moment." The rope loosened. Asher pulled his hands free, wincing as blood flow returned painfully to his fingers. He stood, steadying himself against the wall for a moment. "The papers are hidden outside, near the foundation." He moved to the door, checking the yard. Empty except for distant figures gathered near the main house. He led the servant around to the back of the shed, where loose boards covered a small gap in the foundation. He crouched and reached inside, pulling out a wrapped bundle of oilcloth. Inside were the ledger pages Clara had shown him days earlier, the records of unpaid debts, mismanaged accounts, evidence of the plantation's financial collapse, but also something more. Notes Clara had added about the household's moral chaos, the accusations flying between the women, the systematic abuse they had hidden. "How do I get these to Avery's assistant?" Asher asked. The servant thought quickly. "There's a young man with them, dark hair, carrying a leather case. He keeps walking between the house and the carriage, checking documents. If you can get close enough to ask him for water." Asher nodded. He rewrapped the papers tightly, making the bundle small enough to conceal. "Go back inside before anyone notices you're gone." The servant hesitated. "Miss Clara said to tell you she's sorry. Sorry she couldn't do more. Tell her she's done enough. More than enough." The servant turned and hurried back toward the main house, disappearing around the corner. Asher waited another moment, then moved carefully across the yard. He kept his posture humble, his movements measured. Just another worker, barely worth noticing. Near the front of the house, he saw the scene clearly now. Avery stood on the porch with Eleanor, his expression stern and unmoved by her agitated explanations. Margaret hovered nearby, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Helen sat on a bench, her face pale. 3 assistants moved between the house and a carriage parked in the drive. One was indeed young, dark-haired, carrying a leather case filled with papers. Asher approached slowly. The assistant glanced at him without particular interest. "Sir," Asher said quietly, keeping his eyes lowered, "could I trouble you for some water? Been locked in that shed all night." The assistant's expression shifted to vague sympathy. "There's a pump behind the kitchen." "Yes, sir. But my hands are still numb from the ropes." Asher held up his wrists, showing the red marks where the binding had cut into skin. "Having trouble working the handle." The assistant sighed, but nodded. "Wait here." As he turned toward the kitchen, Asher moved closer to the carriage. The assistant had left his case on the seat. Asher pulled the wrapped bundle from his shirt and dropped it quickly into the case, pushing it down beneath the top layer of documents. The assistant returned with a tin cup of water. Asher drank slowly, making himself visible but unremarkable. "Thank you, sir." The assistant nodded dismissively and returned to the carriage. He picked up his case without looking inside, heading back toward where Avery stood questioning Eleanor. Asher moved away, returning toward the workers' area. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. Inside the house, the confrontation was escalating. Through the open windows, voices carried clearly. "These numbers don't match what you reported last quarter," Avery was saying. "The discrepancies suggest either incompetence or deliberate concealment." Eleanor's voice rose defensively. "My late husband managed the books. I've simply maintained. You've maintained nothing. You've allowed this estate to collapse while living beyond your means." Margaret's voice cut in. "I told her months ago we needed to reduce expenses. You told me nothing of value." Eleanor snapped. The assistant with the leather case approached Avery, saying something too quiet to hear. But Asher saw him pull out the wrapped bundle, showing it to his employer. Avery's expression changed immediately. He unfolded the oilcloth, reading rapidly. His face darkened with each page. Mrs. Whitford. His voice cut through the arguing women like a knife. Where did these additional records come from? Eleanor stepped forward, confused. What records? Detailed accounts of mismanagement, personal correspondence discussing improper conduct, notes describing systematic moral violations within this household. The color drained from Eleanor's face. Margaret made a small choking sound. Helen stood abruptly, swaying. I don't know what you're referring to. Don't insult my intelligence. Avery's voice remained cold, controlled. These documents describe behavior that would destroy your social standing completely if made public. They also provide legal grounds for immediate foreclosure based on moral turpitude clauses in your loan agreements. Margaret grabbed Eleanor's arm. What did you do? What did you tell them? I told them nothing. Then where did those papers come from? Helen's voice broke into sobs. This is divine punishment. I warned you both. I warned you this would bring judgment. Be silent. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. You participated just as much as anyone. I was coerced. I was frightened. Helen collapsed back onto the bench, weeping openly. Margaret turned on Eleanor with sudden viciousness. I will not be ruined for your mistakes. I will not carry the blame for your inability to maintain control. My mistakes. Eleanor's voice rose to a near scream. You were the one who suggested, who encouraged. Ladies! Avery's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. Compose yourselves immediately, or I will have you removed from this property within the hour. Silence fell, broken only by Helen's quiet crying. Avery looked at each woman in turn. Until this estate's status is legally resolved, all property transfers are frozen. All disciplinary actions against workers are suspended. All household operations will be supervised by my office. He gestured to his assistants. Inventory everything. I want complete records of all assets by tomorrow. Eleanor tried once more. Mr. Avery, surely we can discuss this privately. There is nothing to discuss. Your creditors will be notified today. Foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately. He turned away from her, addressing his assistants. Make sure all workers are accounted for and unharmed. Any evidence of recent punishment should be documented. One assistant nodded and headed toward the quarters. Asher stood near the barn, watching everything unfold. The Whitford women's power was dissolving in real time, collapsing under the weight of their own secrets and failures. Ketchum emerged from the house, his face showing confusion and anger. He looked toward the tool shed, then back at Avery, clearly uncertain what authority he still possessed. The assistant who had gone to check on workers approached Asher. You're the one who was confined last night? Yes, sir. The assistant made notes in a small book. Any injuries? Bruises. Nothing permanent. You're released from confinement pending the estate's resolution. Return to the quarters and await further instructions. Asher nodded and walked slowly toward the workers' area. No longer bound, no longer waiting for punishment. The turning point had arrived exactly as he had sensed it would. Behind him, the three Whitford women stood on the porch in various states of collapse, their world crumbling around them while the banker's cold efficiency dismantled everything they had tried to protect. The next morning arrived with surprising stillness. For the first time in weeks, no bells rang to summon workers to the fields. No overseer's voice barked commands. The air hung quiet, except for birdsong returning cautiously to branches near the big house. Asher woke on his cot in the quarters, muscles aching from yesterday's confinement, but mind alert. Around him, other workers stirred slowly, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed the day before. The white women screaming at each other, the banker's cold authority, the sudden suspension of all normal operations. You think they're really done? Jonas asked quietly from the next cot. Asher sat up carefully. Done enough that we're not working today. That ain't the same as free. No, but it's different than yesterday. Outside, the plantation looked strange in its stillness. Fields that should have been filled with laborers stood empty. The barn doors remained closed. Even the chickens seemed confused, wandering aimlessly without anyone to feed them. Near the main house, Avery's carriage still waited in the drive. Through windows, Asher could see figures moving, the banker and his assistants, going room by room with deliberate efficiency. Inside, the questioning had begun. Eleanor sat rigid in the parlor, her composure barely maintained, as Avery read through documents spread across the mahogany table. "Explain this payment," he said, pointing to a ledger entry. $500 to a Charleston merchant for fabric and furnishings, while 3 loan installments went unpaid. Eleanor's jaw tightened. A plantation mistress has certain obligations to maintain appearances. Appearances you could not afford. Avery's tone remained flat, factual. Your household expenses exceeded your revenue by nearly 40% last year alone. My late husband left me with responsibilities. Your late husband left you with a failing enterprise that you accelerated into complete ruin. He set down the ledger and picked up another document. One of the pages Asher had slipped into his assistant's case. But financial mismanagement is only part of the problem. Eleanor's face paled. "I don't know what you're referring to. Don't lie to me, Mrs. Whitford. I have detailed accounts of systematic abuse within this household. Coercion of enslaved workers for purposes that violate every standard of moral conduct. Those are fabrications. They match testimony I've already collected from your own relative." He gestured toward the hallway where Margaret waited, her face blotchy from crying. "Your sister-in-law has been quite forthcoming about the household's private activities." Eleanor stood abruptly. "Margaret is a liar and a manipulator." "Sit down." Avery's voice cracked like a whip. Eleanor sank back into her chair, visibly shaking. "You will answer my questions truthfully, or I will ensure every detail of this household's conduct becomes public record in bankruptcy proceedings." Down the hall, Margaret sat in the dining room with one of Avery's assistants, her composure completely shattered. "I was forced into it," she said through tears. "Eleanor controlled everything. She made me feel like I had no choice." "You had choices, Mrs. Whitford. You don't understand what it's like. Being a widow with no income, dependent on family charity. She held that over me constantly." The assistant made notes without sympathy. "Did you personally coerce any of the enslaved workers?" Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. It wasn't. I didn't think of it as coercion. That wasn't my question." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes." In the library, Helen sat with her face buried in her hands, while another assistant questioned her. "Mrs. Pembroke, your husband is a respected preacher. Did he know about your conduct?" "No. God, no. He would be destroyed if he knew." She looked up with wild, desperate eyes. "You can't tell him. Please. It would ruin his ministry. Ruin everything. That's not my concern. I was weak. I was lonely. I let the devil tempt me, and I fell. But I can repent. I can change. The time for repentance was before you participated in systematic abuse." Helen collapsed into fresh sobs, her pious facade completely dissolved. Upstairs, Clara finally emerged from her room where she had been confined. An assistant unlocked her door at Avery's instruction, informing her that she was no longer restricted. She descended the stairs with measured steps, her composure restored, but her eyes holding a new hardness. She found Avery in the parlor, still questioning Eleanor. "Aunt Eleanor," Clara said quietly, "I need to speak with Mr. Avery." Eleanor looked at her with mingled fear and anger. "Clara, stay out of this." "No." Clara's voice remained calm but absolute. "I'm done staying out of things I should have confronted months ago." Avery gestured to a chair. "Miss Whitford, Please sit. Clara sat, folding her hands carefully in her lap. I want to understand the legal process for the property seizure. The estate will be liquidated to satisfy debts. All assets, including land, equipment, and enslaved workers, will be sold at auction within 60 days. Including the people currently living in the quarters? Yes. Clara drew a steady breath. I have a modest inheritance from my father. It's held independently from this estate. I want to use it to purchase certain individuals before the general auction. Eleanor's face went white with fury. You cannot? I can, and I will. Clara turned to Avery, ignoring her aunt completely. Is that legally permissible? Avery considered. If you can demonstrate independent funds and make fair market offers, yes, it would actually expedite the liquidation process. Then I want to purchase Asher first, immediately. And I want the bill of sale written to allow instant manumission. Clara, you stupid girl, Eleanor started. Be silent, Avery said without looking at her. To Clara, that's your choice as a purchaser. Though I'm curious why you're prioritizing this particular individual. Because my aunt has treated him with exceptional cruelty. Because he saved my life and was nearly punished for it. Because it's the right thing to do. Avery nodded slowly. Very well. I'll have the papers drawn up within the hour. Clara continued. I also want to purchase the families currently at risk of separation. The Johnsons, the Washingtons, the Reeds. I'll grant all of them immediate manumission and provide travel funds north. That will exhaust most of your inheritance. I'm aware. Eleanor found her voice again, shaking with rage. You would throw away your security for slaves? You foolish, ungrateful. I would rather be poor and decent than wealthy and monstrous. Clara stood. Mr. Avery, please prepare all necessary documents. I'll sign them as soon as they're ready. She walked out of the parlor without another glance at her aunt. By midday, the documents were prepared. Avery's assistant brought them to the quarters where Asher waited with the others. Asher, the assistant called. Come with me. Asher exchanged glances with Jonas, then followed the man to a small office that had been set up in the plantation's counting house. Clara sat at a desk with papers spread before her. Avery stood nearby, witnessing the transaction. Asher, Clara said quietly, I'm purchasing your freedom. Not to own you, to free you immediately. Asher stared at her, processing words that seemed impossible. Miss Clara, the papers are already prepared. As soon as I sign and pay, you'll have manumission documents, legal proof of freedom. He struggled to find words. His throat felt tight. Why? Because it's the only right choice. Because I should have done more sooner. Because you deserve a life that belongs to you. Avery set several documents on the desk. Miss Whitford will sign here. You'll receive a copy of the manumission papers. You're free to travel north with her assistance or make your own arrangements. Clara signed quickly, her handwriting steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Avery countersigned as witness. Then he handed Asher a folded document with an official seal. You're a free man, Avery said simply. Asher took the papers with shaking hands. He had imagined this moment countless times, but never believed it would actually happen. The weight of the document felt both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. There's more, Clara said. I'm also freeing the Johnson, Washington, and Reed families. Everyone who wants to travel north with me can. I'll provide initial funds for resettlement. Asher looked at her steadily. That's more than generous, Miss Clara. But I need to be clear about something. What? I'll accept your help getting north. I'll be grateful for it. But I won't be dependent on you indefinitely. I'll earn my own living. I'll build my own life. Clara smiled faintly. I wouldn't expect anything else. And the others, they'll need more than money. They'll need work, community, safety. I know. I'm still figuring out how to help with that. But we'll work it out together. As partners, not as mistress and servant. Asher nodded slowly. Then I accept. And thank you. For everything. By late afternoon, the news had spread through the quarters. Families gathered their few belongings, whispering in disbelief about sudden freedom. Children ran between cabins, not fully understanding but sensing their parents' cautious joy. Avery completed the final seizure documents as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Eleanor, Margaret, and Helen were informed that they had 7 days to vacate the property. They would leave with personal belongings only. Everything else belonged to creditors now. Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, her perfect composure finally shattered completely. Margaret had already fled to stay with distant relatives. Helen had locked herself in a guest room, refusing to speak to anyone. The Whitford dynasty, built on forced labor and maintained through cruelty, was dissolving into bankruptcy and disgrace. Outside, Asher stood at the edge of the property with Clara and the newly freed families. Wagons were being loaded with supplies for the journey north. Children climbed into wagon beds while their parents double-checked travel documents, still half convinced this might be a dream they would wake from. The sun touched the horizon behind the big house, casting long shadows across fields that would soon be sold to new owners. The mansion itself looked smaller somehow, its white columns no longer symbols of power, but merely paint over rotting wood. Asher held his manumission papers carefully folded in his pocket. He looked back at the plantation one last time, at the quarters where he had survived, at the barn where he had worked, at the house where he had endured systematic torment. Then he turned away and climbed into the wagon beside Clara. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red as darkness prepared to claim the collapsing estate behind them. The town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, sat nestled in a valley where the Susquehanna River curved eastward through gentle hills. Winter had passed, and spring was beginning to show itself in the stubborn green shoots pushing through the last patches of snow. The town was small, barely 3,000 souls, but it had something the South never offered: the possibility of building a life that belonged entirely to yourself. Asher stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching morning lights spill across Main Street. The building was modest, just a single room with a workbench, tool racks, and a small stove for heating glue. But it was his. He had signed the lease himself, using money earned from his first carpentry jobs. The landlord, a Quaker named Samuel Green, had shaken his hand with genuine respect and called him Mr. Asher without hesitation. It had taken several months to reach this point. The journey north had been long and complicated. The wagons had carried them to Columbia, where they boarded a train that traveled through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Clara had arranged lodging through a network of abolitionists, Quakers mostly, along with free black families who had settled in Millbrook years earlier. Those first weeks had been disorienting. Everything felt different. The cold air, the unfamiliar accents, the strange sensation of walking down a street without wondering if someone would stop you and demand proof of your right to exist there. The freed families stayed close together initially, finding comfort in familiar faces while learning to navigate a world that offered freedom, but not always welcome. Asher had thrown himself into work immediately. He offered his carpentry skills to anyone who needed them, often charging less than other craftsmen just to build his reputation. He repaired broken furniture, constructed shelves, built a chicken coop for a widow on the edge of town. Word spread quickly that he was reliable, skilled, and fair. Within 2 months, he had earned enough to lease the workshop. Within 3, he was training 2 younger men, both formerly enslaved, in basic woodworking techniques. Teaching them felt important in ways he struggled to articulate. It was not just about craft. It was about showing them they could build something with their own hands that no one could take away. Jonas worked beside him most days. His friend had adapted to freedom more slowly, carrying decades of caution that could not be shed like old clothes. But he was learning. He smiled more often now. He made jokes. He argued with Asher about the proper way to join corner posts, and those arguments felt like the most normal thing in the world. Clara lived several streets away in a boarding house run by a stern but kind widow named Mrs. Patterson. She visited the workshop occasionally, usually bringing news from the abolitionist community, or asking Asher's opinion on job opportunities for newly arrived families. Their relationship had shifted into something neither of them had words for. Not friendship exactly, but a bond forged through shared trauma and mutual respect. She never treated him as if she had saved him. He never treated her as if he owed her anything beyond honest gratitude. They existed as equals, and that equality felt more valuable than any debt of obligation could have been. This morning, she arrived just after breakfast, carrying a newspaper folded under her arm. Asher was teaching Marcus, one of his apprentices, how to plane a board smooth when she knocked on the workshop door. "Miss Clara," Asher greeted her, setting down his tools. "Just Clara, please. We've been over this." She smiled faintly, then glanced at Marcus. "Good morning, Marcus. How's the training going?" "Real good, ma'am. Mr. Asher's a patient teacher." "I'm sure he is." She turned back to Asher. "Do you have a moment? I wanted to share something with you." "Of course." Asher gestured toward the small office area he had set up in the corner. Just a desk and 2 chairs, but it gave them privacy. They sat, and Clara unfolded the newspaper carefully. "I received a letter from an acquaintance in Charleston last week." She included this clipping. She handed him a short article from a South Carolina Society page. Asher read it slowly, his reading skills still developing but improving steadily. The piece described a small coastal town where 3 former members of prominent families now lived in reduced circumstances following unfortunate financial difficulties. It did not name them directly, but Clara pointed to the relevant passage. "That's them," she said quietly. "Eleanor, Margaret, and Helen. They're living together in a rented cottage in a town where no one knows their history. Or at least, no one is supposed to." Asher read the passage again. The article was brief and dismissive, treating their downfall as minor gossip rather than the collapse of an entire dynasty. "Are they—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Are they suffering?" "Not physically. They have enough to live on, apparently. But they're completely cut off from society. No invitations, no respectability, no influence. The things they valued most." Asher set the newspaper down carefully. He waited for some feeling to arrive. Triumph, satisfaction, even pity. But all he felt was a distant, cool relief, like watching storm clouds finally break apart after days of threatened rain. "I don't take pleasure in it," he said slowly, "but I'm glad they can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt me. Hurt others." Clara nodded. "I feel the same way. I used to imagine what I'd want to say to Eleanor if I saw her again. But now I realize there's nothing to say. She's just irrelevant." "That's the best punishment," Asher said. "Not suffering. Irrelevance." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the strange distance that now existed between their present lives and the plantation that had once defined everything. "Do you ever regret the choices you made?" Clara asked. "Not leaving, but the things you had to do to survive while you were there?" Asher considered the question carefully. He had thought about it often during sleepless nights in his new home. The manipulation, the careful lies, the way he had learned to play on the women's fears and jealousies. None of it felt honorable, but honor had been a luxury he could not afford. "I regret that I had to do it," he said finally. "I don't regret that I did it. If I hadn't, I'd probably be dead, or still there, and the families I helped free would still be enslaved." "That's a difficult distinction to live with." "It is, but I'm learning." He met her eyes steadily. "I didn't become a good man through what happened at the plantation, but I didn't let it make me into something worse than necessary. That's the best I can say." Clara reached across the desk and squeezed his hand briefly. "You're a better man than most would have been in your position. Don't forget that." After she left, Asher returned to the workshop where Marcus and Jonas were working on a commissioned cabinet for the town's general store. The three of them worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of tools against wood creating a steady, grounding pattern. By late afternoon, they had finished the cabinet's frame. Jonas stepped back, examining their work with a critical eye, then nodded with satisfaction. "That's good work," he said. "Real good." Marcus grinned, proud of his contribution. "Think Mr. Henderson will be pleased?" "If he's not, he's a fool," Jonas replied. Asher smiled, watching his friend's growing confidence. Jonas had been his anchor during the darkest times at the plantation. Now they were building something new together. Not just furniture, but lives that had substance and meaning beyond mere survival. The sun began its descent toward the western hills as they cleaned the workshop and prepared to close for the day. Asher locked the door carefully, then walked the familiar route back to his home. A small house he rented on the edge of town, close enough to the workshop for convenience, but far enough for quiet. The house had 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a porch that overlooked a small garden plot, where he planned to plant vegetables once the ground thawed completely. It was not much, but it was his. He climbed the porch steps and settled into the chair he had built himself. Sturdy oak with a high back and comfortable armrest. The evening air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys. Across the street, the Johnson family's children played a chasing game in their yard, their laughter bright and unrestrained. Mrs. Johnson called them in for supper, her voice warm with affection rather than fear. The Washington family's windows glowed with lamplight as they gathered around their dinner table. These were the families Clara had helped him free. They were building lives now, working, learning, raising children who would never know the weight of chains. Jonas emerged from his own small house next door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Asher and settled into the second porch chair with a satisfied grunt. "Good day's work," Jonas said. "Good day's work," Asher agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Lanterns began to glow in windows up and down the street, warm points of light against the gathering darkness. Asher thought about the plantation sometimes, not with longing, but with the strange detachment of remembering a nightmare after waking. The big house, the quarters, the fields stretching endlessly under brutal sun. Eleanor's cold commands, Margaret's false sympathy, Helen's pious manipulation, the constant calculation required just to survive each day. That world felt impossibly distant now, like it had happened to someone else. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. His hands, calloused from honest labor, rested steady on the chair's armrest. The manumission papers sat in a wooden box inside his house, but he rarely needed to look at them anymore. Freedom was not a document. It was this: the ability to sit on his own porch, in his own chair, watching his own neighbors live their own lives. He was no longer property, no longer a pawn in others' fears and desires, no longer someone whose body and choices belonged to people who saw him as less than human. He was Asher, a carpenter, a teacher, a free man. He had turned oppression into opportunity not through violence or revenge, but through patience, intelligence, and the willingness to do whatever survival required. He had manipulated his oppressors' weaknesses, used their secrets against them, and orchestrated their downfall, not for satisfaction, but for liberation. And now, in this small northern town, he was building something that no one could ever take away. The darkness deepened. Stars began to appear overhead. Jonas sipped his coffee and made a comment about tomorrow's work. Asher replied, and they fell into easy conversation about wood grain and joint techniques, and whether Marcus was ready to take on more complex projects. The lanterns glowed warmer as full night arrived. Asher sat on his porch, finally free, finally whole, finally home. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.